3 weeks after my Amish husband Levi walked out of our home without a single word of explanation, I found the locked wooden box. It was hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his workshop, covered in sawdust and silence, and I almost didn't pry it open because my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't feel my fingers. I was 7 months pregnant with our first child, still wearing the prayer covering he had once said made me look like an angel, still cooking meals for two out of habit, still waking up every morning reaching for his side of the bed before the grief crashed back down like a physical weight on my chest, still setting his coffee cup on the table each dawn as if he might walk through the door and sit down like nothing had ever happened. That box changed everything in ways I still cannot fully comprehend even now, years later, sitting in the quiet of my own home with my daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room. Inside was a stack of letters tied with frayed twine, a thin leather-bound church ledger with pages worn from use, and a faded photograph that made the world tilt sideways and my stomach drop through the floor. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known in that moment of discovery, was that my marriage had never been a marriage in any real sense of the word. It was a contract, signed in secret by the bishop in his cold office, enforced by my own father who had promised to protect me, and sealed with the heavy, suffocating silence of my mother who had known everything from the very beginning and never once warned me. My name is Sarah, and if you had met me 5 years ago, you would have seen exactly what my community wanted you to see and nothing more. A quiet, obedient, perfectly molded Amish girl in a cornflower blue dress that had been sewn by my mother's hands, hair pinned so tight it pulled painfully at my temples every single day, eyes always slightly downcast in the way we were taught from childhood, meant proper feminine humility before God and man. I could quilt a 9-patch pattern in a single afternoon without a single mistake. I could can 80 quarts of peaches without breaking a sweat even in the heat of August. And I could recite the Ordnung's exhaustive expectations for a godly wife from memory before I even understood what being a wife actually meant in the real world beyond our closed community. Levi Yoder started courting me when I was 19 years old, just a girl really, barely past childhood and still naive about the world's cruelty. He was tall and serious with strong hands that built furniture so beautiful it looked like it belonged in a museum, and when he smiled at me across the singing circle on Sunday evenings, I felt something stirring inside me that I had been told was dangerous to feel, but which felt undeniably holy and sacred. Our fathers were friends who had grown up together in the same district. Our mothers sat together at quilting circles every Tuesday afternoon, and the bishop nodded approvingly whenever he saw us in each other's company. It was a perfect match, the kind that makes an entire community exhale with collective satisfaction, the kind that gets whispered about approvingly at Sunday services, the kind every parent prays for their daughter. We were married in the fall when the leaves were turning gold and red, under a sky that looked like a quilt itself, stretching endlessly above our heads. And I believed with my whole heart and every fiber of my being that God had written our story in permanent ink that could never be erased or rewritten. The first year was not what I had expected, but I told myself over and over that no marriage ever is, that all couples have adjustments to make, that love grows slowly like a garden in springtime. Levi was kind, always kind, but terribly distant in ways I couldn't name or understand, holding my hand during prayer but never reaching for it afterward, building us a beautiful bed but rarely sleeping in it before I did, always finding some excuse in the workshop that needed his attention. When I asked him if something was wrong, if I had done something to displease him or push him away, he would say, "Sarah, you're perfect. It's me. It's always been me, not you." And those words haunted me because they explained nothing while sounding like they explained everything, leaving me more confused and frightened than before I had spoken. Then I got pregnant, and for a few weeks he seemed lighter than I had ever seen him, like maybe this baby was the bridge we had both been waiting for to cross the distance between us. He started humming in the workshop, old hymns I hadn't heard him sing since we were courting, and one night he put his hand on my stomach and whispered something I couldn't quite hear but which I chose to believe was a prayer of thanks. I let myself believe the hard part was over, that we had weathered the storm and found solid ground, that God had answered my desperate prayers and brought my husband back to me in body and spirit. That was my first mistake, the first of many I would make in trusting the lies that had been built around me. He left on a Tuesday in late August when the heat was oppressive and the corn was high, and I can still tell you exactly what he was wearing because I stared at that blue shirt until the color burned permanently into my memory like a brand on my soul. He set down his coffee cup, the one I'd bought him at the general store with our last extra dollars, the one with the tiny chip in the handle I always meant to fix, and said, "I'm leaving you, Sarah. Tonight." No argument had preceded this moment, no tearful confession in the night, no slammed door or raised voices that might have prepared me. Just those simple, devastating words, delivered with a quiet, terrible finality that made my stomach drop all the way to the cold floorboards beneath my bare feet. I said, "Is there someone else?" Because that's what wives in my world are taught to ask, as if betrayal could only take one shape, one form, one unforgivable sin. He looked at me for a long moment, an endless breath of time that stretched into eternity, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before in all our years together. Not anger, not cruelty, not coldness or indifference. Shame so deep and all-consuming it looked like drowning, like a man going under for the final time with no hand reaching down to save him. "It's not what you think," he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking on the words like breaking glass. "It's not another woman. I can't tell you more than that. I'm not allowed, Sarah. I promised I would never tell." And then he walked out the kitchen door, past the garden I'd planted with such hope, past the workshop where our wedding bed still lay unfinished, and out onto the dirt road that led away from everything I had built my identity around. The community's response was swift and brutal, like a knife drawn across tender skin. The bishop announced the following Sunday that Levi had been placed under the ban, shunned, and cast out for abandoning his wife and unborn child in a way that brought shame upon the entire district. I was not formally shunned myself, but I quickly learned there are things far worse than formal exclusion. Women who had been my friends for years, who had shared quilting circles and canning days and whispered prayers with me, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes across the room. My own sister Rebecca told me through tears that her husband had strictly forbidden her from visiting me because my household was now considered spiritually unstable and a danger to their family's standing. An elder's wife pulled me aside after service, her face arranged in the sweetest smile she could manufacture, and said with poisonous kindness, "You must have refused him, dear. Men don't leave satisfied wives. A husband only abandons his home when his wife has failed him somehow." I stood there in my stiffest dress, pregnancy swelling visibly under my apron, and realized I was being blamed for something I didn't even understand. The loneliness was a physical weight pressing on my chest every time I walked through the empty rooms of our house, heavier than any burden I had ever carried, heavier even than the child growing inside me. I would stand in the kitchen and hear echoes of his footsteps, sit at the table and see his empty chair, lie in bed and reach for warmth that was never there. And then I found the box, that terrible, beautiful box that would shatter everything I knew. I found it because I was desperate, tearing through his workshop for anything that might explain why the man I loved had evaporated into the night like morning mist. The floorboard creaked under my weight, my swollen belly making it hard to kneel. And when I looked down, I saw the edge of something dark and wooden hidden in the shadows. It took me 10 minutes of struggle to pry it loose from its hiding place, my fingers raw and bleeding by the time I succeeded. And when I finally lifted the heavy wooden lid, the smell of old paper and something faintly like cedar and secrets filled the air around me. The top layer was letters, dozens and dozens of them, all tied carefully with a frayed piece of twine in a neat bundle. They were all addressed to Levi in handwriting I didn't recognize, fine, elegant script unlike any Amish hand I knew, and the return address was a city I'd never heard of in a state far from our district. I opened the first one with trembling fingers that could barely grip the paper, and the world I had been living in crumbled around me like dry bread falling to dust. The letters were from a man named David, and they were love letters, the kind of passionate, intimate letters I had always secretly wished Levi would write to me but never did. David wrote about stolen hours spent together in the city, about the way Levi's laugh sounded when no one from the community was watching, about secret plans they'd made to run away together someday when the burden became too heavy to bear. One line from a letter seared itself into my brain like a hot brand, words I would never be able to forget no matter how hard I tried. I know you married her because you had to, because they made you, but she will never know the real you the way I do. You belong to me, Levi. You always have, and you always will. I sat on the dusty floor of that workshop, my baby kicking desperately inside me as if feeling my anguish, and I screamed into my own hand until my throat was raw. My husband hadn't just left me, I realized as the pieces fell into place like shards of broken glass. He had never been mine to begin with. Not really, not in the way I had believed with all my naive, trusting heart. Our entire marriage had been a cover, a carefully constructed lie designed to hide a truth the Amish world considered an unforgivable abomination. But the box held more terrible revelations, more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. Beneath the letters was a thin leather-bound ledger, the kind the church uses to record important decisions and spiritual judgments, and I opened it with hands that had stopped trembling because I had gone beyond fear into something colder and more dangerous. There were pages and pages of handwritten notes covering years of secret decisions, all in the bishop's precise authoritative script I would recognize anywhere. Entries going back 3 years before my wedding, before I had even met Levi at the singing circle. One entry read in cold clinical detail, met with Levi Yoder regarding his unnatural desires, counseled him to pursue marriage as a spiritual cure. Sarah Miller, identified as suitable candidate, devout and unsuspecting. Her father has been informed and agrees to the arrangement. My father agrees. I read that devastating phrase 17 times in a row, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were telling me, the words blurring through my tears. My own father, the man who had walked me down the aisle with tears of happiness in his eyes, the man who had taught me to pray and work and trust in God's plan, had known everything from the very beginning. He had given me to a man who was being forced to marry me as a form of spiritual punishment and reformation, using me as a tool, an instrument, a cure for something I didn't even know existed. I wasn't a bride walking toward love and hope and family. I was a prescription, a medicine, a sacrificial lamb offered up to protect the church's reputation. The photograph at the bottom of the box was the final blow, the killing stroke that shattered whatever hope might have remained. It showed Levi and David together, arms wrapped around each other without shame or hiding, smiling with a freedom and joy I had never once seen on my husband's face in all our years together. On the back, in Levi's familiar handwriting, were the words I still cannot read without weeping. The only place I ever felt like myself. Forgive me, Sarah. I stared at that photograph until the light outside the workshop faded to purple twilight and darkness crept into the corners. And when I finally stood up with aching joints and swollen feet, the weight in my chest had transformed into something else entirely. Rage, pure, cold, clarifying rage, burning away the grief and confusion, and leaving only the terrible fire of righteous anger in its place. I wasn't just a discarded wife, a failed woman, a shame to my community. I was a human sacrifice, an innocent victim offered up on the altar of church reputation by the very people who were supposed to protect me from harm, guide me toward truth, and shelter me from evil. I had been used, betrayed, and abandoned by every single person who had promised to love me. I didn't tell anyone about the box right away. Not a single soul in my community, not even my sister who had betrayed me. I hid it under my own floorboards in the bedroom, wrapped in cloth, and spent the next 3 days in a haze of sleepless investigation, my mind racing through possibilities and memories, re-examining every conversation I had ever had. I started asking questions carefully, quietly, with tremendous caution, to people I still trusted just enough to risk the conversation. An old midwife who had delivered me as a baby, now stooped and gray, let slip in a hushed voice that the bishop has always been harsh on the young men, pushing them into marriage far too early to settle their troubled spirits, and some women pay the price. A former schoolteacher, now elderly and somewhat outcast herself, told me in a trembling whisper that my case was not the first child, and it won't be the last. There have been others, women who were used the same way, sold to men who could never love them, and then cast aside when the arrangement failed. The picture forming in my mind was larger and darker than I had imagined, spreading like poison through the community. Levi wasn't an isolated sinner, I realized with growing horror. He was part of a dark pattern, a secret system the church leaders had been operating for decades, burying uncomfortable truths behind hastily arranged marriages and terrified young women who were never told the truth about their husbands. The system was designed to protect the church's reputation at any cost, even the cost of innocent lives. The first major twist came when I confronted my mother in her own kitchen, the same kitchen where she had taught me to need bread and trust in God and believe in the goodness of our community. I laid the photograph of Levi and David on the wooden table in front of her and watched her face. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before her expression went completely blank, like a door slamming shut, and I knew in that terrible instant that she had already known everything. "Sit down, Sarah," my mother said in a voice I had never heard before, not gentle, not loving, not comforting, but cold and calculating and utterly without warmth. "Your father and I did what was best for you and for the community. Levi needed a wife and you needed a husband, a good Amish family, stability. What did you think marriage was? It's not about feelings. It's about order. It's about duty." I stared at the woman who had raised me, who had held me as a baby, who had taught me my prayers and sewn my dresses and kissed my scraped knees, and I saw her for the very first time without the blinders of love. Not as a nurturing mother, but as an enforcer of a cruel system that had chewed me up and was preparing to spit me out entirely. I asked her if she knew about the other girls, the ones the midwife had whispered about, the ones who had been sacrificed like me. She turned her back to me and started washing dishes with aggressive force, a clear dismissal, her shoulders rigid with tension she couldn't hide. "There were no other girls," she said flatly, her voice hollow and unconvincing. Whatever you know nothing. You're making things up, Sarah, because you're hurt. This is gossip. This is sin. That night, I took the box to an English lawyer in town, a sharp, competent woman named Catherine who had once helped an Amish girl get a restraining order against an abusive father. Catherine was skeptical at first, used to dramatic stories from our closed community, but when she opened the leather ledger and started reading the bishop's incriminating entries, her expression shifted to one of shocked recognition. Sarah, this is evidence of a conspiracy. Multiple forced marriages. This isn't just about you. I think we're looking at a systematic cover-up that goes back decades. She asked if I would be willing to go public to take the church to court to expose the system that had destroyed so many lives. I was 7 months pregnant, completely alone, more terrified than I had ever been in my entire life, but I thought about my baby, about the world I was bringing her into, about the future she deserved, and I said yes. Yes, I would stand. Yes, I would speak. Yes, I would burn the whole corrupt system to the ground, if it meant my daughter would never be sold the way I had been sold. The legal battle that followed was a war on multiple fronts, a brutal, exhausting fight against people who had known me my entire life. The bishop sent representatives to offer me a quiet settlement, a small house on the edge of the district, a monthly stipend to live on, and complete erasure of the scandal if I would just return the ledger and sign a paper promising eternal silence. I refused without hesitation, watching their faces shift from confident to shocked. My mother showed up at my door late one night, not to apologize for her betrayal, not to beg forgiveness, but to threaten me with the only weapon she had left. If you do this, Sarah, you will have no family, no community, no home. Your child will grow up without roots, without cousins, without history. Is that what you want for her? I looked at her, this woman who had known the truth from the very beginning, who had dressed me for my wedding with a smile while hiding the knife behind her back, and I said with cold finality, I have no mother. You made sure of that the day you sold me to a man who could never love me. You killed any love I had for you with your silence. She flinched as if I had struck her, and for just a fleeting moment, I saw something human beneath the mask of cruelty. Then it was gone, replaced by cold fury, and she walked away into the darkness without looking back. As the case progressed and more victims came forward, Catherine and I began to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. A woman named Miriam, who had been married to an older man at 18 and later, discovered he was writing letters to a man in another district. A woman named Ruth, whose husband had left her after 3 months, and who had been told by the bishop she was too worldly to understand his spiritual struggles. A woman named Esther, who had simply disappeared one night and was never spoken of again. Each new story was a mirror of my own, and I wept for every single one of them. The courtroom scene was not a criminal trial, but a civil suit filed by several of the women, demanding acknowledgement and financial restitution for the damage done to our lives. I testified for 2 hours, my voice steady despite the shaking in my hands, and I watched the faces of the church leaders as they heard the truth for the first time. Levi testified again, publicly apologizing to me and to the other women for his role in the deception, and for the first time I saw real remorse in his eyes. In the end, the church was ordered to pay a settlement and implement new policies, though how enforceable that would be in a closed community remained unclear. The victory felt hollow in some ways because you can't legislate a change of heart, but it mattered to the women, to Esther, Ruth, Miriam, and me. We formed a support group that still meets, bound by a shared history no one outside could fully understand. My father wrote me a letter saying he was sorry and had been misled by the bishop. My mother sent nothing at all. I kept the box safe, the evidence of my own destruction and resurrection, and I waited for the next letter from a girl named Naomi to remind me that the work of justice has no final page.